Well, welcome. We'll get started just in a few minutes. You'll notice the gang's all here. There's a ton of folks. And this is going to be a really, broad kind of conversation. Before we get started, I just wanted to highlight that we have some wonderful experts that are here today.
Are you recording?
And so we have everybody from Professor Jesse Hill of Case Western University. We have Dr. Anita Somani, who's been an OBGYN for 30 years. We have Reverend Terry Williams, and he has a church in Chillicothe, Ohio. He is active with Faith Choice, and he's an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ. You'll notice that Maria Bruno is here with Equality Ohio. She is their public policy director, and she went to Ohio State. We also have Camille Wimbish. Now, Camille Wimbish is with Ohio Voice, and many of us will know her from her election kind of work. But she actually coordinates the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. And so we're blessed to have her with us here today. And she also went to Ohio State for law school. So let's see, who am I forgetting? We also have one of the most famous plaintiffs, Jim Obergefell. We're just really happy that he's joined us. And you might say to yourself, oh, wait a second, how does this all connect? Well, one of the things that's really cool about this conversation is that we're going to talk about a lot of different topics. And one of the things that's interesting is how many different things connect to one another. And so with that, we've hit 7:03, and I thought it was a good point for us to start. I just really want to welcome you. We are the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. And so we started about 7 years ago. And the whole idea was folks didn't really know that much about the court system, and specifically about the state level court system. And I have to say, I started to get interested because I was seriously irritated by money in judicial elections. I was concerned about, recusal standards, and I was concerned about kind of how this whole process worked. And so, as we think about, how this is coming together, we were really focused on the notion of, the court system should exemplify equity and fairness and justice for all. But if we don't actually know about the court system unless we're lawyers or we're, a participant in other ways, it really is a challenge, and we should all get engaged. And so I always say my background is social work, and I think it's important to give permission to have conversations about the importance of fair courts. And so I encourage you all to put your name and where you're from into the chat. We're going to begin a conversation. You'll notice Camille is here with me. So the way that it works with a fishbowl is that, you basically have a little bit of a conversation. There are two people that'll be in the fishbowl. So right now we have Camille Wimbish from Ohio Voice. Once again, she is the fearless leader of the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. I'm going to ask her a question, kind of kick off the conversation. At some point, what'll happen is she'll be ready to, ask a question of another person, so that basically we're going to be handing it off to another person, some experts, some people who have lived experience. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I just really wanted to welcome you all. And with that, Camille, are you ready for the first question to kick off the conversation?
I'm ready.
Okay.
One moment. Anyone, please, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat, and we will ask them at the end of the conversation.
So, the one person that I did not introduce that you all should know is Jessica Dickinson. And Jessica helps do the organizing for the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. And we have to say a big thank you to her for getting us all together to do this. And so I'm noticing all the different places that people are from. And I just, once again, wanted to say welcome. This is going to be an interesting conversation. We're going to be covering a lot of different things. So the one thing I want to tell you before we ask Camille her question is this other thing. We are going to be sending you slides. We're going to be sending you links to some action items. So do not worry. You don't have to be taking, pictures or screenshots. We'll be getting that stuff to you. Camille, are you ready to have your question?
Okay, let's hear it. What's the
Well,
question?
it's one of those biggies. Can you tell us a little bit about the state of the courts now? A little bit about gerrymandering and how redistricting plays into some of the reasons that we're paying attention to the courts. And certainly, how does the Dobbs ruling impact state courts and specifically the Ohio Supreme Court? And with that, I'm handing it to Camille.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's so great to be here with you tonight. I am joining today because I am interested in our state courts. State courts are really on the front lines in the battle to protect our civil rights and our most precious freedoms. And of course, many of us were shocked and outraged by the reversal of Roe. But I think it's important to highlight that it's not just reproductive rights and freedoms that are at stake in the aftermath of that decision. And the fact that the US Supreme Court has really been shifting power back away from federal courts and into the state courts. And in doing so, they're eroding some really important protections that all Americans want to enjoy. So in looking back to just 2013, we had a huge safeguard that was lost when the Supreme Court of the United States gutted the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, they issued Shelby versus Holder. And as a result, voting rights are under attack. We've seen hundreds of pieces of legislation in all of the states around this country, going after things like strict voter ID, cutting early voting, just making it much more difficult particularly for people of color to be able to have access to the ballot. And so those are issues that are being determined on a state basis. We can also look to the 2019 decision in Rucho versus Common Cause, where the federal court said, hey, we recognize that gerrymandering is really awful to our democracy. It's not great that we've got politicians who are manipulating district lines to unfairly favor their political party, but hey, it's not for federal courts to really do anything about that. We're going to send that back to the states to decide if they want to do something about that. Of course, we had last month's decision in the Dobbs case that was overturning nearly 50 years of abortion access, leaving it up to state courts to decide. So we can only anticipate there's going to be mountains of litigation around abortion access. And we'll hear a little bit more about the issue of marriage equality tonight. We're going to hear about how the court has even intimated that they may want to revisit a decision just as recent as 2015 in the Bergerfeld versus Hodges case. We've got our plaintiff here to tell us a little bit more about that. So we know that marriage equality, the issue of, can you love who you want to love? Those choices could be coming right back to the states. So those are some of the really critical issues where the US Supreme Court has said, we're not going to provide those levels of protections. We're going to kick it to the state courts. And that's why we're really trying to focus in on this webinar and why the Ohio Supreme Court is important. And I want to back up a little bit and say, some people are saying like, hey, how is it that the US Supreme Court or courts in general even have the power to make these types of important decisions over our lives? And I'd say, courts aren't here to really write the laws. That's the role of the legislature. They write the laws. The judicial branch, where courts fit in, they're there to interpret the laws. They're there to decide if it's constitutional, if the rules are fair. They were really intended to be a check and balance over the other branches of government to make sure that no one branch is more powerful than the next. And then when we think about what's happening in the Ohio landscape, our Ohio legislature is led by a supermajority of Republicans. So that means that the Ohio legislature can pass a law or laws without a single Democratic vote. So there's no real incentive to have any sort of bipartisanship. So they can govern from extremes. They can pass laws without the support of the governor. And so that means that the only way to stop the legislature when it does overreach is to have a really strong Supreme Court acting as a check and balance. Now, Catherine did ask a little bit about what's going on with Ohio's redistricting. Now, I know many of you have been following along closely with great shock and horror and all of the nonsense that's happened. But I think it's a perfect example for why we need strong checks and balances to guard against lawmakers who are overreaching. You know, the Supreme Court, Ohio Supreme Court has stepped in, not once, not twice, but I think it's now 7 times to say, hey, these maps are unconstitutional. And so it's really unfortunate that lawmakers are able to sort of run out the clock and to have us voting on unconstitutional maps this August 2nd. But the high note here is that we really have the power and ability to make sure that we have a strong and independent court that can serve as a great check and balance to protect against those types of power grabs, because we know the fights are coming to our state courts and we've got to be ready.
Well, Camille, thank you. And with that, I'm leaving the fishbowl. Bye, everybody.
Okay, Jesse, you're up on the fishbowl. Are you ready? My question to you is, can you tell us a little bit about what's at stake in Ohio Supreme Court race and why does it matter so much?
Yeah, great question. I think, so I'm going to be in my law professor mode tonight and start by just talking about, what is the Ohio Supreme Court? First of all, I know we've got a bunch of very well-informed voter types here tonight, but I think it's not always obvious to people how this whole thing works. So people know, and you were talking about this too, Camille, that we have this, the US Supreme Court. We know most people kind of have a sense of what the US Supreme Court does. Lately, what it does is it takes our rights away and tells states they can do whatever they want, like with abortion rights. But we also do have our own Ohio Supreme Court. And unlike the US Supreme Court, we vote to elect the justices that sit on the Ohio Supreme Court. So they really do work for us. And they really are supposed to be protecting our rights. And then what's more is we have our own Constitution in Ohio that has its own rights and guarantees in it. And our Ohio Supreme Court can enforce that Constitution and protect our rights, regardless of what the US Supremes say. So the Ohio Supreme Court is so important because it's this extra layer of protection for people's rights. And that's really how it was always meant to function. The whole idea, again, going into my constitutional law professor mode, it was always meant to function that we had 2 separate layers of government, the federal government and the state government, because that was supposed to be 2 layers of protection for people's rights. And so the Ohio Supreme Court, now the ball is kind of in its court now that the Supreme Court has thrown out abortion rights under the US Constitution. The ball is really in the court of the Ohio Supreme Court, the court's court, to decide whether or not Ohio is going to protect Ohioans' right to reproductive privacy and to access abortion. And there's actually a case pending in front of the Ohio Supreme Court right now that it may or may not decide to hear soon, that does ask that very question, and that does ask that court to recognize under the Ohio Constitution that we here in Ohio have a right to access abortion, and that the 6-week abortion ban that's currently in place in our state ever since the Dobbs decision came down, to decide that that's unconstitutional. So it's so important. And really that's true of all kinds of rights. I mean, all kinds of rights. If the US Supreme Court walks away from them, says our Constitution, our federal Constitution doesn't protect them anymore, we can always ask the Ohio Constitution, the Ohio Supreme Court to recognize those rights. And I think we'll be hearing more about that tonight.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have you pass it off to the next speaker.
Okay, great. I see Dr. Somani has come into the fishbowl.
Yes.
So go ahead.
I was going to say we're swimming in the shark's tank right now.
Yes. So thank you. So it's my turn to ask a question of you then. So I have given my law professor lecture. Now I guess I'm going to ask you from the medical perspective to talk about what is the impact of sort of on the real world and on real patients of this decision. What's going on?
So the real world impact is that, we are telling patients abortion is still legal until 6 weeks. But how does that translate into real life, right? Over 90% of abortions in Ohio happen after 6 weeks. On average, most of them are at 8 weeks. The ones that people always sort of address when they're anti-abortion is, oh, partial birth bans or partial birth abortions. Well, that is I believe it's like 0.5%. So 5 out of 1,000 happen after 21 weeks. So it's pretty uncommon. But
Early,
what happened?
not this early, right? They mostly happen early, just not this early.
Exactly. And, the ones that you see, that are happening at 21 weeks are the ones that are the most devastating, because they're typically patients who want that pregnancy, who want to continue to, grow their families. But those are the ones that are in a tough situation. For us right now as physicians, there are areas that are black and white. So ectopic pregnancies, we can intervene and take care of those before it becomes life-threatening to the patient. That is actually one of the ones that is under the exemption for the abortion bill here in Ohio. So that's a black and white. If the mom is dying, that's a black and white. However, where the gray areas come in, and these are the areas where we're sort of between a rock and a hard place. We're in this decision-making process of, do we risk our patient's life or do we risk our medical licenses? Those are some of the new laws that are being implemented. So just to give you some real life examples that have happened ever since this law took place, we have and this literally happened a month ago. 21-year-old patient comes in. She's about 17, 18 weeks pregnant. So she's just starting her 4th month of pregnancy, comes in because she's leaking fluid. Turns out her water is broken early. Well, previously we would have induced labor. We would have said, you have the option to have a D&E or go through a labor process so that you don't get infected because your water is broken. Now what's happening is those patients are getting sent home. So this patient got sent home. She came back a week later by squad. She had a fever. Her blood pressure was super low because she was septic. She was literally on death's door, and she got admitted to the ICU, got antibiotics, got pressors, which are basically to hold someone's blood pressure up until they begin to be able to compensate and recover from the onslaught of the infection. At that point, there was no heartbeat, so they were able to evacuate the products of conception, and she eventually got better. But what we don't know long-term is that patient going to have kidney damage? Is that patient going to have pulmonary or lung damage or damage to her heart because of that onslaught of infection that, affected all of her organs? So in the end, is she now going to be a high-risk pregnancy? Is she going to be able to get pregnant because of the infection that was in her uterus? So these are some tough decisions, Think about the situation where you have somebody who we do an ultrasound or we do early genetic testing and find out that the fetus has an anomaly that's incompatible with life. Is that mom now forced to go through a pregnancy where she may develop high blood pressure, she may develop diabetes, she may end up with preeclampsia or have a seizure, and now her health is at risk, despite the fact that in the end, the fetus will deliver and die? And the emotional impact of going to the grocery store, of going to work and having people say, what are you going to name your baby? Is this a boy or a girl? Those things are real issues. And we need to look at that when we think about laws that are being passed. They're not being passed to help women. They're being passed to hurt women, to increase their risk of dying. So some future issues that may arise in some of the more onerous bills that are being passed, personhood bill, for example. I'm sure you've heard of this, Professor Hill, the idea that a fetus is a person, and we all laugh about the pregnant woman in Texas who's like, hey, I get to go in the carpool lane because I have 2 people in the car. But in all seriousness, when from a physician standpoint, our reproductive endocrinology colleagues, they are treating families who desperately want children. So they do in vitro fertilization. They basically will harvest more than one egg, 4 or 5, 6, depending on how many the woman produces at any given time, fertilize those embryos, and then look at the genetics. If the genetics are damaged or they're just not normal embryos, then typically they've been donated to science or they've been basically destroyed. And then they only take the healthy embryos and implant them. So now we have a situation where a physician could be charged for discarding those embryos, or the patient could be charged, or you're going to be forced to implant all those embryos, which then increases the risk of preterm labor and preterm delivery. I'm seeing something in the chat that I think is really critical to talk about. The Turnaway study was a 10-year study that looked at women that were denied abortions and just all women getting abortions, but the main thing was women who were denied abortions because they got in too late or they didn't know they were pregnant soon enough. And when they followed these women over 10 years, 95% of them actually were very happy with their decision. They had been successful in life. Some of them had gone on to have more children. The other big thing that they looked at was economic success with these women. Most of them were able to complete their education or to go on to have higher paying jobs. So everything that the right-wing talking points were all debunked in this study. The other big one that was debunked was, in this study, only 10% would choose adoption, given the the choices for those who ended up having to carry their pregnancy. So it's a very important study. They had really good long-term data, long-term follow-up, and that leads us to know that from a scientific, evidence-based situation, we know that it's super critical to keep abortion as reproductive health care, to have it as a decision that we all can utilize when we need to, whether we're physicians or patients. The one other area that I'm going to touch on before we move on is the area of medications that are used for more than abortions. So methotrexate, misoprostol, we've seen some examples already of methotrexate prescriptions being denied to women with arthritis, women with autoimmune conditions, because it is also used for ectopic pregnancies and for abortions. So that's another scenario that you need to think about, like in the future, as far as patients who have other medical conditions that now may not be able to access the medications that they need. So that's super, critical, and also one of those things that we need to look at when we're looking at what laws do we want to protest against, or what laws do we want to write to our representatives about, to make sure that that is not being pushed.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you painted a vivid and troubling picture of the impact on patients. And I can only imagine, also what the impact is on providers, on doctors, and others who are working with patients right now in this incredibly difficult time. I'm sure you could talk about that too, but it's time for me to jump out of the fishbowl and welcome Reverend Terry into the fishbowl.
Yeah, so Reverend Terry, thank you very much for joining. Appreciate you being here. And my question, and I guess it's a question that we all have, is does fairness matter anymore? Does it matter that we vote? I mean, I'm hearing that from a lot of friends. I'm hearing that from a lot of younger people. Like, what difference does it make if we vote? It doesn't matter because the outcomes are always the same. And how do we hold our legislators accountable? How do we improve things in Ohio?
Powerful questions, Dr. Somani. And I think just seeing in the chat here, there are a lot of League of Women Voters folks in the session today. And as a League of Women's Voter member, LWV in Chillicothe Ross, I always remind people it is important to vote, right? Voting is not the be all end all, but I think of voting as harm reduction. Because when we think about fairness, there's really kind of two poles to fairness, two places that I think we meet that question when we talk about abortion rights and particularly reproductive health rights and justice. It's the fairness of outcomes in legislation and our political system. But even more importantly, it's fairness in outcomes for people. The folks that you were just speaking of, the patients that you mentioned, and just touched on a very small number of folk. Those are the individuals who work with us at Faith Choice Ohio and Ohio Clergy for Choice see every single day, and have for decades, since before Roe and now after Roe, for years in the past and years in the future. We experience, along with these individuals, the pain and the struggle that gets heaped upon them from unfair systems, from systems that deny them the right to have the abortion that they want to have, from systems that make it so difficult that they have to put themselves through extra strain and stress to get the kind of care they need. That fundamental unfairness matters a great deal. It matters to people in this state who are denied access today, who would not have been denied access for the same procedure 4, 5, 6 weeks ago before Dobbs. And that fairness is ultimately linked to the greater unfairness, which is that unfairness around the rigged political system. People have asked me the same question that you posed, like, well, if it's all rigged, if these super majorities are pre-programmed by gerrymandering, and we tried to fix it, we tried to have these ballot initiatives, why do we vote anymore? And my response is always, we must continue to press forward in whatever method we can. 2015, 2018, we saw these ballot initiatives supported by the vast majority of voters. It is not a partisan political position to say we believe in fairness, because in Ohio we do. 70% of voters from all backgrounds said fairness matters. It matters that we have the ability to control our destiny in this democracy, and our ability to make majoritarian decisions that most people agree with, and not be led by a minority viewpoint that is, quite frankly, often a very small minority of one particular religious tradition that is forced on the bodies of Ohioans writ large. This is the struggle, I believe, when it comes to elections and voting, that elections and voting are one piece. The harm reduction of elections and voting have to be paired with the advocacy that you have done so well throughout your career, bringing all of who you are as a doctor to meet the public sphere, to say, this is what we need from you in the legislature. This is what we need from, individual municipal authorities, for people to be able to come forward and make this care available. And the third piece of that is that community care, that we will not leave each other alone. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So for those of us in faith communities, we continue to do that kind of direct community care. We continue to work through organizations like the Jubilee Fund for Abortion Justice, where we are activating faith communities and like-minded individuals to provide transportation for people, to get people access to the care they need, because fairness matters, not just in theory, but in the lives of real people. Those legislators will be held accountable, and they will be held accountable by communities that refuse to allow these situations to defeat us and to put us under. For us in this place, that is my hope. And I hope that we believe in fairness. I really do. Thank you, Dr. Somani, so much for being here and for the work that you do.
Thank you for the work that you do. And I'm not sure who said this, but I always tell people, if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't try so hard to get rid of your vote, right?
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
I'm in your church today. Thank you so much.
So absolutely. Well, thank you, Maria. I'm going to step out so that Maria can step in.
And I am so excited to get to be with Maria for even just a moment. Maria Bruno is the public policy director at Equality Ohio. And as an openly queer clergy person in Appalachia, I just have to say, you and your organization always show up for me. And I'm so glad that you are in this place and in this fight. I know intimately well, for me, why my identity as a queer person intersects with this conversation about abortion access, about privacy, bodily autonomy. But I'm interested to know, like, writ large in the work that you do, can you explain the intersection between LGBT equality, work, abortion access, bodily autonomy, and particularly how things are moving right now in our state?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I mean, you will often hear people say when they come for one of us, they come for all of us. And that's true, not just from like an idealistic perspective, but it's true just from a legal perspective. You know, when we're talking about constitutional rights, what we're really talking about is boundaries for the government. We're talking about what the government has the right to involve itself in and not. And so things like the right to privacy, the right to love who you want, the right to do what you want in your bedroom, the right to have access to medical care. All of these things are pieces of that same puzzle, which is that right to privacy, that right to bodily autonomy, that right to make decisions for yourself. And I often think of constitutional law as kind of like a Jenga tower. This is the second time today that I've used this metaphor. But so each, you know, when a case gets overturned, it's kind of like removing one of the pieces in the Jenga tower. And so the more that are removed, the more precarious the rights that rely on those cases are. So for things like Dobbs, for things like Roe being overturned, the reality is that it puts all of our rights into a more precarious position, because one of the foundational cases that was used for a case we're about to hear a little bit more about, Obergefell via Hodge, that was because we had that foundational principle of what the government is allowed to get involved in. And so, you know, the right to abortion, you could sub out pretty much any argument for or against with the right to have trans youth medical care access. I mean, it literally is a parallel discussion, because again, the real question is, what is the government allowed to do and what line are we drawing?
Thank you so much, Maria. That really hits home. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna tap out of the fishbowl, and I think Jim Obergefell is up next. I think there's Jim.
Yes. Oh, I'm so thrilled that Jim was able to join us. Jim, thank you again for your willingness to come today. And you know, I know you have been a named plaintiff in a landmark civil rights case, and I was wondering if, you know, one thing that we're talking a lot about is the power of courts to both protect and to harm rights. And I think, you know, you being involved so intimately in litigation that was so powerful, we really would love to hear a little bit of just about like how that came to be, but then also your reaction to the Dobbs ruling and how you're feeling right now.
Well, thanks, Maria. And I'll join Reverend Terry in saying thank you to you and everyone with Equality Ohio for all that you do. You do such amazing work for the queer community and our allies in this state. So thank you, Maria. You know, how did I end up in that case? Well, it really was a series of situations I could have never imagined. I mean, it started really, the heart of it was my partner, John. We'd been together for about 18 years when he was diagnosed with ALS. And he was dying of ALS in 2013. He had started at-home hospice care. And on June 26, 2013, I was holding his hand when the news came out that the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act in their decision, United States versus Windsor. And I spontaneously proposed to John. We hadn't talked about it. It wasn't something we had discussed, other than in the mid-90s, we agreed we wanted to get married, but for us, it had to be something legal. It couldn't just be symbolic. And with DOMA being struck down, that meant we could actually get married and at least have the federal government recognize us. So we did. We got married inside a chartered medical jet on the tarmac of the Baltimore-Washington International Airport. And that was all we wanted to do. We just simply wanted to say, I do, and we wanted to live out John's remaining days as husband and husband. Well, there was a story about us in the newspaper 2 days after we got married. And as a result of that story, we met a civil rights attorney in Cincinnati, Al Gerhardstein. And in our first conversation with Al, he pulled out a blank Ohio death certificate and said, do you guys get it? When John dies, this is going to be wrong, because Ohio will say he's unmarried, and Jim, your name won't be there as his surviving spouse. You know, hearing that broke our hearts. We had just gotten married. We had just said, I do. We were saying husband hundreds of times a day. That's how much it meant to us. And then to learn that John's last record as a person would be wrong, it broke our hearts, but I think more importantly, it made us angry. And Al asked if we wanted to do something about it. And we said, well, we discussed it and said, we do. So we ended up suing the state of Ohio and the city of Cincinnati, because they're both involved in death certificates, to demand recognition of our marriage on John's death certificate when he died. And we filed in federal court. You know, this event tonight is really about state courts. Our case started in federal district court. Al knew that that was the place for us to start because of John's health. We didn't have the time to start in a state court. We started right in a federal court. And on July 22nd, 2013, we won in federal district court. And federal judge Tim Black said, Ohio, you have to recognize their marriage when John dies. John died 3 months later. And then after he died, Ohio appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And of course, that court decided that the other case from Ohio and the cases from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, that court told all of us plaintiffs that we were in the wrong place. We were wasting the court's time, that we should be out on the streets, changing hearts and minds. We should fight our fight in the court of public opinion, not the court, not a federal court, even though courts exist to protect our rights. Well, they ruled against us, which set up our appeal to the Supreme Court. And luckily, the Supreme Court said, yes, we will hear your case. And well, we all know how that turned out. And I have to say, June 26, 2015, as a gay man, that was the first time in my life as an openly gay man that I felt like an equal American. And that's just 7 years ago. And then to see the Dobbs decision, and number one, to see the highest court in the land take back a right that court had previously affirmed. What a terrible day for our nation. What a horrible day for women and pregnant people in our nation. They can no longer control the decisions they make about their own bodies. What a gross invasion of privacy. And then to read Justice Thomas's concurrence in the Dobbs decision, where he paints a target on more rights that we enjoy: the right to birth control, the right to intimate relations with the person you love in the privacy of your own home. Once again, privacy. This is the highest court in the land saying our privacy is not a right, that the government has a right to invade our privacy. And also Obergefell v. Hodges. Now, the thing that really infuriated me about that concurring opinion is that Justice Thomas seems to forget that his very own marriage exists because of a Supreme Court decision. And I find it utterly appalling that he would say Obergefell should be reconsidered when his marriage exists because of the Supreme Court. And then we also hear senators across the country saying that Obergefell should be overturned, and making the claim that marriage has always been, for the more than 200 years of our nation's history, marriage has always been up to the states. Well, again, just like Justice Thomas, they seem to forget Loving versus Virginia. So when I think about what I went through, what all of those other plaintiffs and I went through, as well as the plaintiffs in all of those other marriage cases that were happening across the country, to see this and to hear this, it disgusts me that there's still such hatred towards people who are different, and that they think the government should have the right to say, you can get married, but you cannot. Marriage is one of those decisions that we deserve as human beings. We deserve to commit to the person we love, and marriage is a civil right. It is not a religious right. And I wish they would stop claiming that marriage is holy matrimony takes place in a church. Holy matrimony did not take place in that chartered medical jet. Holy matrimony doesn't take place inside a courtroom in a civil marriage. So it's just really frustrating for me that we have a Supreme Court now that is really putting their religious beliefs above the civil and human rights of people in this nation. And I'm worried about LGBTQ+ rights. I'm worried about marriage. I am hopeful that the Respect for Marriage Act will pass in the Senate. I certainly hope that happens. And as I like to say, for a party that claims they are pro-family, voting in support of marriages and the families that come with those marriages, that should be an easy answer. It's a no-brainer. If you're pro-family, you should vote in favor of that. So hopefully that will happen. And I'm just going to go back to something Reverend Terry said as my last comment, and that is talking about voting. Why should we vote? Does our vote matter? I talk about this a lot, an awful lot. Every time I speak, I bring up voting, and I like to remind people the reason we have the Supreme Court that we currently have, this extreme Supreme Court that took away a right we have relied on for 50 years and could take away more. The reason we have that court is because people didn't vote. So when you think, why should I vote? Does my vote matter? It does. And you're not voting. Your lack of voting matters. Your lack of voting has led to a loss of a right that we have relied on and needed in this nation for more than 50 years. And it sets the stage for more rights to be taken away. Because as you said, Maria, I think it was you, Maria, when one right is taken away, every other one is at risk.
Yeah. And that actually, thank you. That was so inspiring to just listen to. But that reminds me of bringing it back to the state court, bringing it at home with both why the courts are important and why voting matters. The state Supreme Court is going to be one of those potential safeguards for our rights if we have a court that respects our rights. We have things like trigger bans that are happening at state houses, including our own. And that trigger ban, for anyone unfamiliar, basically says the second they overturn Dobbs, we have illegal, it's illegal to have an abortion. And in theory, if they start to use that tool, they can use that for anything, right? So, Jim, do you have any, specific reasons that you think that the state Supreme Court right now is really something that people should care about that hasn't yet been mentioned?
I mean, nothing that I can specifically think about, but I will also just follow on your mention of trigger bans. Ohio's Defense of Marriage Act is still on the books, and we're not the only state like that. So if Obergefell v. Hodges should happen to be overturned at the Supreme Court, and if the Respect for Marriage Act isn't passed, well, the moment that Obergefell is overturned, we could once again be in a state that does not allow same-sex marriage and will not recognize out-of-state lawful marriages. So state level is so important, and that's our state legislature voting to protect the rights that we rely on, the rights that we need. And it's also having a Supreme Court that values what we value, a Supreme Court that actually reflects who we are as a state and as a people, so that when these challenges come to laws that actually protect rights and care for people, we have a Supreme Court that will say, no, this is the right thing. This is just, this is constitutional. The worst possible thing we can have is a state Supreme Court that will overturn and say we don't matter, and say that these rights that we have relied on, the rights that we should have as human beings and as Ohioans and as Americans, no, you really don't get those. So I can't give anything specific other than the terrifying thought that we could end up with state and federal courts that really believe our nation, our rights, our understanding of humanity and of the world should be stuck in the late 18th century as of the time the Constitution was written. And I think that's a terrifying thing for anyone to claim as the right thing. I mean, I'll end with this because I say this a lot. In 1787, when the Constitution was written, the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." Well, in 1787, we the people did not include Black people, did not include Indigenous people, did not include women, did not include queer people, and we could go on and on. It included white landowning men. So to say that our laws, our Constitution can only be interpreted as of that time, that's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for keeping our nation and our rights, our humanity stuck hundreds of years in the past. And we need a state Supreme Court that will help prevent that.
Thank you. And I didn't even warn Jim that I was going to ask that question, and he gave that. So, and with that, I will leave the fishbowl and pass it back to Catherine Terser.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much, Maria. Now, Catherine, I think I went on there a little bit long, so hopefully I didn't take up too much time for questions, but I'm going to—
No one is annoyed. I just think everybody's so appreciated hearing your story and making us think, what are the other challenges and why should we, yes, we're here because we care about the Dobbs decision and we care about bodily autonomy. And this then is connected. And I think it's so important for us to think about how important this is and how this impacts our lives going forward. So I just really appreciated hearing from you.
Well, thanks, Catherine. So, talking about the Supreme Court, state Supreme Courts, and, I had firsthand experience in that kind of verified Supreme Court courtroom. Ethics, judicial ethics are so vitally important. And can you just talk to us a bit about what judicial ethics are, why they matter, and why we should care?
Well, I think most of us have a pretty general understanding of why we should care. When you think about, courts are a place that can literally take your life. Think about the death penalty. Courts can take away your children. When you start to think about just the role of, the role of the courts clearly in the criminal justice system, and we think about the importance of equity there, I think none of us that are here today came to this not thinking the courts were important, but I do think that we should be thinking about the courts a lot more than we do. And so I always encourage people to think about judicial codes of conduct. And it's funny. I've often said I've spent almost 30 years of my life hitting my head against a wall because I've been a redistricting reformer for a really long time. And I've often thought, when we finally got to the court, the other thing I've spent, 20 some odd years working on had to do with the judicial code of conduct and recusal standards. And it was this weird intersection of both. So what do we see in a judicial code of conduct? And this is just generally, when you think about the code of conduct for federal judges, not the Supreme Court. I don't know if you knew this. They don't have a judicial code of conduct or ethical standards that are that they are supposed to adhere to with lifetime appointments. But when you think about a judicial code of conduct, it's really the focus is on making sure the judges are independent and impartial, and that they are not giving the appearance of impropriety. Because all of us want to go to court and knowing that we are going to get a fair hearing. Yeah, we might want to have the judge on our side, but at the end of the day, we go to court and we expect to have a fair hearing. And so it's the judicial codes of conduct really focus on the needs to be as impartial as possible, independent as possible, diligent, meaning, paying attention to what laws are there, but then also stepping away from cases where you might have a vested interest. And so this, for example, when we talk about recusal, we're talking about stepping away and not hearing the cases, for example, of our family members. And so for many of us, we were really astonished that Justice DeWine, for example, didn't decide to step away and, that he actually decided he was going to hear cases about redistricting. It was just astonishing. So when we think about the kinds of rules that are there, judges themselves often are the ones who decide whether or not they have a bias. Okay, so think about that. If you have a bias, you don't necessarily know you have a bias, and it actually helps to have someone else help you work it through. Just think, we should have some kind of standards for when there should be a process for deciding whether a judge or justice steps aside. And so as we think about things that we could do to create fair courts, we should be thinking about things like this. Did you know that judges and justices in Ohio can listen to the cases of their major campaign contributors. So the argument is their contribution limits. Okay, so their contribution limits. But of course, let's suppose you wanted something from the courts and you were a big company. You might all get all of the different employees and all of the board members and spouses and kids all to give. And before you know it, that money really adds up and judges are hearing the cases of their campaign contributors. And so, you know, as we're having these really important conversations, I think it's really important to think about what it is we need to do to shore up the court. And also, you know, I was really focusing on Ohio, but certainly knowing that at the federal level, that Clarence Thomas could in fact, and did hear cases that involved Ginny Thomas. This is really problematic. And, you know, rule of law, making decisions that we all have to live with, we need judges and justices that are coming from a place you were describing of love. I would ask for them coming from a place of impartiality and independence and a focus on what works best for individuals and the community. And you know, I'm really glad that we're all here today. I did want to add Camille Wimbish back into this conversation.
Okay.
So Camille, I know that there are a bunch of comments and questions and things that are in the chat, and it just seemed to me that you'd been listening this whole time. It would be great to kind of think about all of the different threads here because we've covered a bunch of different topics. And I was wondering if you could, you know, how shall we say this? Bring it all home.
All right. Well, this conversation has been very insightful and illuminating, and I can definitely see that there's a trend here of folks who want to know what we can do to hold our legislature accountable if there's a supermajority, if they intentionally ignore the rulings of the Supreme Court. What kind of things can we do? Is it a legislative strategy? Can we get bipartisan lawmakers who are writing bills, enshrining same-sex marriage into law and access to contraception into law? What can we do? Catherine seemed like a good person to answer, but if anyone else wants to, maybe you want to start, Catherine, and so anyone else might want to chime in.
Yeah, I definitely want to start with this. So August 2nd is a primary. I want to encourage us all to participate in that. We're going to go through some different ways that we can get engaged, but I do really think that there is a real power to what Jim was saying, that notion of we the people, that it is summer, it's warm enough to, and we're getting together. This is an important time to talk to folks about the importance of the courts, the importance of the Supreme Court vote, because I don't know if you've noticed, it is, you know, we've had multiple times that the Ohio Redistricting Commission has not listened, or the state legislature has not listened when it comes to map making. Well, this could get pushed to next year. And so who is on that Supreme Court is incredibly important because Maureen O'Connor is moving on. And that's just one case that I care about. We can, you know, we can pull environmentalists in here and we can pull in a bunch of other people. And certainly we're talking about Dobbs. You know, I would encourage us to think about finding ways where we can have important conversations, not online, but with one another's, so that we can actually get the word out about the importance of creating an Ohio that we actually want. And Jesse, you're nodding along. It seemed like you might have something to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just, definitely, it's so important. It's so important for the abortion fight. And these issues are all so intertwined. I was just thinking about how the fact that you all have been fighting for fair districts for so long and recently is we partly have you to thank for the fact that the abortion rights landscape isn't even worse in Ohio, because Ohio was ready to pass a total abortion ban. And, you know, these legislators were afraid that they might actually have to run in competitive districts because of the Ohio Supreme Court looking over their shoulder, or, looking at the maps. And so they were probably too scared to actually pass the most radical abortion restrictions that they possibly could. And so, although things are bad, they can always get worse. And it's important to really, to vote, to hold the worst, at bay, but also, to take back our power. Like you said, Catherine.
So Jessica, do you want to throw up a slideshow that has some action items? And while that's happening, so we have that slideshow, I wanted to highlight to you, or highlight the different ways that we can engage and take action. Reverend Terry Williams, do you want to explain some ways that we can take action?
Absolutely. When you start talking about action, the pastors are always ready, right?
Of course.
Those of us in faith communities, no matter what your faith tradition, no matter what your faith background or community connection, we operate the Jubilee Fund for Abortion Justice at Faith Choice Ohio. And we are trying to help activate communities of faith and people who are interested in connecting through those communities to help abortion seekers, no matter what their faith is, no matter what their needs might be, in practical support. So practical support options are things like helping people get access to these clinics that are in other states through transportation, lodging, childcare, whatever the need might be, to be able to do these things in safe, vetted, trained kinds of ways. So you need to be trained, you need to access that, kind of long-term commitment and be, part of a community that kind of understands what the needs are for their local region. So you can go ahead and click on the links that'll be sent to you later on, the community partner interest form, which is for faith communities and groups, and the volunteer interest form, which is for any individuals. That will help get you tied into the pipeline of getting trained, going through the background check process, and getting to the point to where you can start making a difference with the Jubilee Fund for Abortion Justice today.
That's a wonderful resource. Thank you so much for that. What else do we got? Okay, we've got some great questions that have been compiled about candidates. We've got some Supreme Court palm cards. Make sure if you're doing tabling or out and doing events, you have access to those resources to be able to pass out and encourage people to share those. We had Equality Ohio is going to be sending out a newsletter, and they've got, follow them on social media. They've got a whole hot court summer ready for you. There's a number of great nonpartisan resources. We were going to share all of those out in the follow-up email that will have a recording, that will have the slides, that will have all of the resources. So that is all we have for you tonight. We thank you so much for all of your great participation and all of this wonderful discussion. We can't wait to see what's next. So thank you all. Thank you to all of our participants as well.
Thank you, everybody. And
Thanks,
we're ending
everybody.
almost exactly at 8.